Welcome back to the channel. Today, we are shifting our focus. We've witnessed the invisible poison of Chernobyl and the desperate survival of the Andes flight. But today's story takes us to an environment where the enemy is physics itself. It is a disaster that played out in slow motion while the whole world watched on live TV. Yet few truly understand what happened in the silence of the ninth compartment after the cameras turned away. We are building a global community here of people who appreciate dark, atmospheric storytelling. I am always fascinated to see where you are all listening from, whether you're working the night shift, studying, or just relaxing in the dark. So, before we descend to 108 meters, do me a favor, scroll down and leave a comment. Let me know what city or country you are watching from right now. I read every single one. As always, if you appreciate these long-form deep dives, please leave a like on the video. It helps the signal cut through the noise. Now, put on your headphones, turn off the lights. Let's go to August 2000. Sound behaves differently in the deep. On the surface, in the world of air and light that we occupy, a scream is a fragile thing. It dissipates instantly, swallowed by the wind, absorbed by the trees, or drowned out by the chaotic white noise of the living. A cry for help on land has a range of perhaps a few hundred meters before it vanishes into silence. But the ocean is different. The ocean is a medium of terrifying efficiency. Water is 800 times denser than air, and in that crushing density, sound does not fade. It travels. It propagates with a clarity that defies logic, moving 4 times faster than it does in the atmosphere, carrying its message through the cold, pressurized dark for miles without losing its edge. In the ocean, there are no secrets. Every movement, every shift of the tectonic plates, every cavitation of a propeller blade is broadcast into the blackness. The ocean listens, and sometimes, horrifyingly, it speaks back. On August 14th, 2000, 2 days after the pride of the Russian Northern Fleet vanished from the surface of the Earth, the acoustic sensors on the nuclear battlecruiser Pyotr Veliky, Peter the Great, picked up a rhythm. The cruiser was patrolling the grey, chopping waters of the Barents Sea, participating in what was supposed to be a triumphant display of naval power, a war game designed to show the world that the Russian bear had woken from its post-Soviet hibernation. But the games had gone silent, the scheduled communications had failed, and now the sonar operators, men trained to distinguish the biological chittering of shrimp from the mechanical hum of an enemy engine, were listening to something that made their blood run cold. It wasn't the chaotic grinding of metal on the sea floor. It wasn't the groaning of a settling wreck. And it wasn't the random organic noise of the currents. It was percussive, it was sharp, and, most terrifying of all, it was deliberate. Clang, clang, clang. It was the sound of a heavy steel object, likely a wrench or a sledgehammer, being struck against the hollow hull of a submarine. It is a sound that every sailor hopes never to hear, and every sonar operator prays never to detect. It is the universal language of the buried. The frequency was specific. The timing was unmistakably human. On the surface, the admirals were already drafting the press releases. They were preparing to tell the president, the families, and the watching world that the submarine Kursk had been lost with all hands. They were preparing to say that the explosion was catastrophic, that death was instantaneous, that the 118 men on board had been vaporized in a fraction of a second, feeling no pain, knowing no fear. It was a comfortable lie. It was the lie the government needed to maintain stability. It was the lie the Navy needed to save face. It was the lie the families desperately wanted to believe, because the alternative, the truth of what was happening 108 meters below them, was a nightmare too precise to contemplate. But physics does not lie. Acoustics do not care about politics or public relations. The sound waves cutting through the freezing water of the Barents Sea were telling a different story. They were telling the story of men who were not vaporized, men who were not dead, men who were cold, wet, and breathing in the pitch black, swinging a hammer against the wall of their tomb, begging the world above to listen. Dead men don't knock. And for days, the knocking continued. It was a rhythmic plea for salvation that would go unanswered, A slow-motion tragedy played out in the dark while the world argued about secrets and protocols. This is not the story of a sudden death. This is the story of the wait. This is the story of the Kursk. To understand the horror of the knocking, you first have to understand the scale of the machine that was making it. The K-141 Kursk was not just a submarine, it was a Leviathan. It was an Oscar II class nuclear cruise missile submarine, a designation that fails to capture the sheer monstrosity of its engineering. It was 154 meters long, longer than 2 jumbo jets parked nose to tail, the length of 2 football fields. It was 4 stories high. It displaced 18,000 tons of water. It was built with a double hull, a layer of high-strength steel separated from an outer shell by inches of rubber to dampen sound, making it invisible to NATO tracking systems. It was designed to hunt aircraft carriers. It was designed to withstand a direct hit from a torpedo and keep fighting. It was widely considered by naval experts, both Russian and Western, to be unsinkable. Inside this city of steel, life was supposed to be different than the cramped, sweaty conditions of older diesel submarines. The Kursk was the pinnacle of Soviet luxury and might. It had a swimming pool. It had a sauna. It had a solarium with sun lamps to give the crew a taste of vitamin D during the long, sunless months of Arctic patrol. It was a symbol of national resurgence, a floating fortress that carried 24 granite crews, missiles, each capable of carrying a nuclear warhead that could level a city. When it left the port of Vidyayevo on August 10th, heading out for the Summer X naval exercise, it carried the hopes of a crumbling military on its back. The crew was the elite, 118 men. The average age was barely 25. They were sons, fathers, and husbands who believed in the invincibility of the vessel beneath their feet. They had no reason to suspect that the greatest threat to their lives wasn't an American hunter-killer sub or a rogue mine, but a single faulty weld on a practice weapon sitting in the torpedo room. The Barents Sea is a cruel place to die. It is a shallow shelf of the Arctic Ocean, a stretch of water known for its violent storms and bone-chilling temperatures. But the tragedy of the Kursk is that it didn't happen in the abyssal depths. This wasn't the Marianas Trench. The submarine didn't vanish into an endless void where recovery was physically impossible. When the Kursk hit the bottom, it settled at a depth of only 108 meters. To put that in perspective, the submarine itself was 154 meters long. If you could have picked the Kursk up and stood it vertically on its tail, the nose would have stuck 40 meters out of the water. They were so close to the air. They were so close to the sun. In the clear waters of the Caribbean, divers freedive to that depth on a single breath. Sunlight can penetrate that deep. From the surface, looking down, the water is a murky, impenetrable grey. But from the bottom, looking up, you can almost sense the sky. This proximity is what transforms the disaster from a mechanical accident into a psychological torture. The survivors weren't lost in outer space. They were just right there, just beneath the waves, close enough to be heard, close enough to be found, but separated by a barrier of water and steel that might as well have been 1,000,000 miles thick. The official timeline of the disaster is sterile. It lists times and seismic magnitudes. It notes that at 11:28 a.m. local time, a seismic event of magnitude 1.5 was registered. 2 minutes and 15 seconds later, a second event, magnitude 4.2, rocked the sensors as far away as Alaska. The data suggests a catastrophe, but data is clean. Data doesn't scream. The reality of those 2 minutes is a chaotic descent into hell that shattered the illusion of the unsinkable ship. The first explosion was a chemical reaction, a leak of volatile fuel that blew the torpedo room doors off their hinges. It was violent, yes, but survivable for the ship. The Kursk was tough. It could have taken that hit. But the fire that followed was hotter than the surface, of the sun in localized bursts. It cooked the other warheads. It triggered a chain reaction that detonated 5 to 7 torpedoes simultaneously. The second explosion wasn't just a bomb. It was an earthquake. The force ripped through the reinforced steel bulkheads, like wet tissue paper. It sent a shockwave, travelling at thousands of meters per second through the length of the ship, twisting massive steel girders, incinerating the command center, and shattering the internal skeleton of the vessel. The water rushed in, not as a flood, but as a solid wall, a hydraulic hammer moving with enough force to crush a human body instantly. For the men in the first 5 compartments, there was no time to process what was happening. There was no time to be afraid. The physics of the explosion moved faster than their nerve impulses could carry the signal of pain to their brains. They were gone before they knew they were dying. But the Kursk was long, and the shock wave lost energy as it tore through the ship. By the time it reached the reactor compartment, the reinforced walls held. The nuclear reactors, sensing the catastrophe, slammed their control rods home, shutting down the power to prevent a meltdown. The lights flickered and died. The hum of the ventilation stopped. The ship, now heavy with thousands of tons of water in its nose, tilted forward and began its slow, silent glide to the bottom. It hit the seabed with a dull thud that reverberated through the hull, kicking up a massive cloud of silt that enveloped the wreck in a blinding fog. And then, silence. In the back of the ship, in the tail section, the world had turned upside down. The men in compartments 6, 7, 8, and 9 had survived the blast. They had been tossed around like dolls, bruised, battered, and deafened, but they were alive. The emergency lights bathed the corridors in a sickly, dim glow. The air was already beginning to smell of ozone, smoke, and hydraulic fluid. In the chaos, training took over. Survival instinct kicked in. They knew that the front of the ship was gone. They knew the reactors were dead. They knew their only chance was the escape hatch in the 9th compartment. One by one, they began to move. Sailors from the turbine room, officers from the reactor control. They all scrambled towards the stern, moving away from the water, away from the death that was creeping up the ship. They climbed through the twisted wreckage, sealing bulkheads behind them, buying time with every heavy steel wheel they turned. They gathered in the 9th compartment. It was a small room, designed to be the emergency escape airlock. It was the last refuge. 23 men squeezed into a space meant for half that number. The air was getting thin. The temperature was dropping rapidly as the freezing ocean water outside cooled the hull. They were alive. But as they looked at the escape hatch above them, and the pressure gauge that told them the grim reality of the water, pushing down on top of it, the realization began to set in. They weren't going anywhere. This is the moment where the story shifts. It stops being an action movie about explosions and sinking ships, and it becomes a chamber drama of agonizing intimacy. The 23 men in the dark didn't panic. They didn't turn on each other. They took roll call. They assessed their resources. They found water. They found the emergency oxygen generating cartridges, chemical canisters that release oxygen when burned, but are notoriously dangerous if they touch oil. And they found a pen and paper. Captain Lieutenant Dmitri Kolesnikov, the highest-ranking officer among the survivors, took charge. In the flickering light, shivering from the cold that was now seeping into their bones, he began to write. He didn't write a report for the Admiralty. He didn't write a technical analysis of the torpedo failure. He wrote a letter to his wife. He wrote a list of the men who were with him. He created a record of their existence, a proof of life that would serve as the only witness to their final hours. And while he wrote, others grabbed whatever metal tools they could find, a wrench, a hammer, a piece of pipe, and they moved to the side of the hull. They knew the procedure. They knew the SOS code. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. They swung the hammer. The sound rang out through the double hull, passing through the rubber anechoic coating, and punched into the open ocean. It travelled up, through the murky thermocline layers, reaching out towards the surface where the sun was still shining. They knocked. They waited. They listened for the answering ping of a sonar, the sound of a rescue submersible latching onto the hatch. They knocked again. They knocked until their arms were tired and the air grew too foul to exert themselves. They knocked because they believed that someone was coming. They knocked because they were the sailors of the Northern Fleet, and they had been told that their country would never abandon them. They didn't know that above them the ocean was empty. They didn't know that the rescue vessels were still in port. They didn't know that their government was currently refusing offers of help from the British and Norwegian navies because they were afraid of spies seeing their broken submarine. They didn't know that they were already ghosts. All they knew was the cold, the dark, and the rhythm of the hammer against the steel. Clang, clang, clang. Chapter 2. The City Beneath the Sea. To truly grasp the magnitude of the tragedy that was about to unfold, one must first come to terms with the sheer physical reality of the vessel itself. In the popular imagination, submarines are often conceived as cramped, claustrophobic tubes, narrow steel pipes smelling of diesel and recycled sweat, where men sleep in hot bunks and navigate spaces so tight that shoulders brush against valves and pipes with every step. This image, born from the U-boat, films of the Second World War, and the diesel-electric hunter-killers of the Cold War, is entirely insufficient to describe the K-141 Kursk. The Kursk was not merely a submarine, it was a cathedral of warfare. It was a submerged city, a leviathan of the deep that defied the conventional limitations of naval engineering. Designated by NATO as an Oscar II class guided missile submarine, the Kursk was a monster born from the paranoid genius of the late Soviet Union. It was designed with a singular, terrifying purpose: to hunt and destroy American aircraft carrier battle groups. In the geopolitical chess game of the Cold War, the United States projected power through its massive supercarriers, floating air bases that could dominate entire hemispheres. The Soviet answer to this dominance was the Oscar II. It was the carrier killer, a weapon system built to endure a nuclear apocalypse and keep fighting. The dimensions of the Kursk are difficult to visualize without a sense of scale. It stretched 154 meters from bow to stern. To put that into perspective, it was longer than two Boeing 747 jumbo jets parked nose to tail. It was the length of 2 American football fields. If you were to stand the Kursk vertically next to the Statue of Liberty, the submarine would tower over the monument, casting a shadow that would engulf the entire island. It stood 4 stories tall, a black monolith of hydrodynamics that displaced 18,000 tons of water when submerged, double the displacement of most Western attack submarines of the era. But it wasn't just the size that made the Kursk a marvel, it was the skin. The submarine was constructed using a double-hull design, a uniquely Soviet engineering philosophy that prioritized survivability above all else. The inner hull, the pressure vessel where the crew lived and worked, was forged from high-strength steel capable of withstanding the crushing depths of the Arctic Ocean. Surrounding this was the outer hull, a separate shell separated from the inner sanctum by a significant gap. This gap was filled with water, equipment, and structural ribs, acting as a massive shock absorber. A torpedo hitting the side of the Kursk would have to punch through the outer steel, traverse the water gap, and then penetrate the inner pressure hull to cause a catastrophic breach. It was armor plating on a nautical scale. Furthermore, this outer skin was coated in a thick layer of specialized rubber tiles known as necoic coating. These tiles were designed to absorb sonar waves rather than reflect them, making this 18,000-ton giant appear as nothing more than a ghost or a glitch on the screens of enemy trackers. To the hydrophones of NATO surveillance vessels, the Kursk was a black hole in the ocean noise, a silent predator that could slip through the sensory nets of the North Atlantic unnoticed. Inside, the K-141 was a stark departure from the grim austerity of its predecessors. It was the jewel of the Northern Fleet, and it treated its sailors accordingly. The immense volume between the hulls allowed for amenities that were unheard of in the silent service. The Kursk boasted a relaxation zone that included a small gymnasium where men could lift weights to counteract the atrophy of long deployments. It had a solarium bathed in ultraviolet light to keep the crew's immune systems functioning during months of sunless Arctic patrol. It even had a small swimming pool and a sauna, a touch of Russian luxury deep beneath the ice. The living quarters were spacious, the air scrubbers were state-of-the-art, and the food was the best the Navy could provide. To serve on the Kursk was not a punishment. It was the highest honor available to a Russian submariner. It was the assignment everyone wanted. By the summer of 2000, the Kursk had become something more than just a warship. It had become a symbol. The 1990s had been a decade of humiliation for the Russian military. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the once mighty Red Fleet had been left to rot at the docks. Ships were stripped of copper wiring by starving conscripts. Nuclear reactors sat unmaintained in rusting hulks in Murmansk. Officers went unpaid for months, and the pride of a superpower had dissolved into a grim struggle for survival. But the Kursk was different. Commissioned in 1994, it was one of the few vessels completed after the fall. It was new, it was maintained, it was powerful. When the Kursk put to sea, it was a message to the world, and perhaps more importantly, a message to the Russian people themselves, that they were still a force to be reckoned with. It was the diamond in a sea of rust. The mission in August 2000 was intended to be the crowning achievement of this resurgence. It was christened Summer X, the largest naval exercise Russia had attempted in a decade. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. 30 ships, including the heavy nuclear missile, cruiser Pyotr Veliky, destroyers, uneven frigates, and smaller attack submarines were gathering in the Barents Sea. They were there to simulate a defense of the motherland against a hypothetical Western invasion fleet. The script of the war game called for the Kursk to play the role of the ultimate antagonist. It was to slip through the defensive screen of the surface fleet, remain undetected, and deliver a simulated missile strike against the flagship. The weapon the Kursk carried for this purpose was the P-700 Granite, known in the West by the ominous NATO reporting name, Shipwreck. These were not mere missiles. They were autonomous drones of destruction. Weighing 7 tons each, the Granites were designed to be fired in swarms. Once airborne, they would communicate with each other, sharing target data. One missile would climb high to act as a scout, locating the enemy carrier group, while the others flew sea-skimming profiles to stay below radar. If the scout was shot down, another missile from the swarm would automatically pop up to take its place. They were terrifyingly intelligent, supersonic, and virtually unstoppable. The Kursk carried 24 of them in massive launch tubes lining its sides, flanking the pressure hull like a row of steel ribs. But on this training mission, the Granites were not the only weapons on board. To practice close-quarters defense, the Kursk was also loaded with torpedoes. In the nose of the submarine, in the first compartment, lay the torpedo room, a space filled with machinery, hydraulic lifts, and racks of green-painted death. Among the standard munitions loaded for the exercise was a Type 65-76 Kit torpedo. It was an older design, a relic of the Soviet doctrine that prioritized raw power over safety. It was huge, heavy, and propelled by a fuel mixture involving kerosene and high-test peroxide, HTP. HTP is a chemical that makes engineers nervous. It is a highly concentrated form of hydrogen peroxide, the same there, stuff used to bleach hair or clean cuts, but distilled to a potency where it becomes a violent oxidizer. When HTP comes into contact with a catalyst, rust, copper, or certain organic materials, it doesn't just burn, it expands. It decomposes instantly into steam and oxygen, increasing its volume by 5,000 times in a fraction of a second. The pressure generated by such a reaction is immense. Because of this volatility, the British Navy had abandoned HTP torpedoes in the 1950s after a fatal accident aboard the HMS Sidon. The Americans refused to touch them, but the Russian Navy, strapped for cash and sitting on stockpiles of Cold War munitions, kept them in service. They were cheap, they were fast, and they were powerful. They were also ticking time bombs if not maintained with surgical precision. And so, on the morning of August 10th, 2000, the Kursk cast off its lines from the pier at Vidyayevo. The weather was calm, the sky a pale washed-out grey, typical of the high latitudes. On the dock, wives and children waved goodbye. unaware that the massive black silhouette, slipping silently into the mist, was embarking on a one-way trip. The crew of 118 men was in high spirits. They were the best of the best, sailing the most advanced ship in the fleet, heading into a war game that would prove to the world that Russia had returned. They moved north, past the fjords and the rocky outcrops of the Kola Peninsula, and descended into the Barents Sea. As the vents opened and the ballast tanks flooded, the 18,000 tons of steel slipped beneath the surface, vanishing from the world of light. The city beneath the sea was now in its element, prowling the shallow shelf of the Arctic, invisible, powerful, and seemingly invincible. But deep inside the nose of the ship, inside a torpedo tube that hadn't been properly inspected, a microscopic chemical reaction was beginning. A seal was degrading. A drop of liquid was weeping from a hairline crack. The countdown had already begun, ticking away in the silence of the deep, unnoticed by the men who were busy piloting their indestructible fortress toward its doom. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the physics of disaster were waiting patiently for their moment to strike. Chapter 3: The War Games. To understand why the death of the Kursk was not merely a tragedy but a geopolitical earthquake, one must first understand the stage upon which the disaster was set. The Barents Sea is not simply a body of water. In the lexicon of naval warfare, it is a bastion. It is a fortress of ice and grey water, a sanctuary where the Soviet Union, and later the Russian Federation, hid its nuclear deterrent from the prying eyes of the West. It is a place where the continental shelf extends like a protective arm, creating shallow, difficult waters that are a nightmare for sonar operators and a playground for submarine captains. For 50 years, this patch of the Arctic Ocean was the silent front line of the Cold War, a chessboard where steel leviathans stalked one another in a game of cat and mouse that carried the stakes of human extinction. But by the summer of 2000, the board had changed. The Soviet Union had collapsed a decade prior, imploding under the weight of its own economic stagnation and political sclerosis. The 1990s had been a decade of profound national humiliation for Russia. The once feared Red Army had disintegrated into a chaotic collection of unpaid conscripts and rusting equipment. The Navy, the projection of global power, had suffered the worst. Ships that had once terrified NATO admirals were left to rot at their moorings in Murmansk and Severomorsk, their hulls bleeding rust into the pristine Arctic waters, their reactors cooling, their crews demoralized and destitute. The West looked at Russia and saw a corpse. They saw a failed state, a gas station masquerading as a country, a bear that had lost its teeth and its claws. The naval exercise of August 2000 was designed to shatter that perception. It was christened Summer X, but to the admirals of the Northern Fleet and the newly inaugurated President Vladimir Putin, it was more than just training. It was a resurrection. It was the largest naval maneuver Russia had attempted since the fall of the Berlin Wall. The sheer scale of the operation was a deliberate message sent directly to Washington and London. We are still here. We are still dangerous. The fleet that assembled in the Barents Sea on that fateful weekend was an armada of defiance. 30 surface vessels churned the water into a white froth. There were destroyers, frigates, minesweepers, and support tankers. Leading them was the flagship, the Pyotr Veliki, Peter the Great. This was a Kirov-class battlecruiser, the largest surface combatant warship in the world that was not an aircraft carrier. It was a nuclear-powered giant, bristling with radars and missiles, a floating city designed to coordinate the destruction of entire fleets. It was the king on the chessboard, and lurking beneath the surface, moving in the three-dimensional silence of the deep, were the knights and the rooks, 5 submarines, led by the Kursk. The script for the war game was classic Cold War theatre. The surface fleet, led by the Peter the Great, would play the role of the defenders, a blue force simulating a Western carrier battle group, encroaching on Russian territorial waters. Their mission was to protect the motherland, to create an impenetrable wall of steel and sensor nets. The Kursk, operating as the Red Force, was the aggressor. It was the lone wolf. Its mission was to penetrate that defensive screen, to slip past the destroyers and the frigates, to evade the sonar dragnets, and to deliver a simulated fatal blow to the flagship. It was a scenario that the Kursk had been built for. It was the apex predator being released into its natural habitat to hunt. The atmosphere on the morning of Saturday, August 12th, was tense but professional. The weather was surprisingly cooperative for the Arctic. Calm seas, light winds, and good visibility. On the bridge of the Peter the Great, admirals in crisp uniforms peered through binoculars, scanning the horizon. Below decks, in the combat information centers, hundreds of young sailors stared at glowing radar screens and sonar waterfalls, watching for the telltale signs of the enemy. They knew the Kursk was out there. They knew it was coming. But the terrifying capability of the Oscar II class was its stealth. Despite its size, the Kursk could move with the quiet grace of a shark. The game was simple. Could the surface fleet find the sub before the sub killed them? But the Russians were not the only ones playing the game that day. The Barents Sea has always been a crowded house. The United States and Great Britain had never stopped watching. Even in the chaos of the 90s, the West kept a vigilant eye on the Northern Fleet, tracking the comings and goings of ballistic missile submarines. Intelligence reports had alerted NATO to the massive exercise. They knew the Russians were putting on a show, and they wanted a front-row seat. Lurking on the periphery of the exercise zone, utilizing the acoustic shadows of the ocean floor to hide, were two American submarines, the USS Memphis and the USS Toledo. These Los Angeles-class hunter-killers were there to gather electronic intelligence, to record the sonar signatures of the Russian ships, and to observe the readiness of their old adversaries. The presence of these foreign guests added a layer of dangerous friction to the exercise. The Russian commanders knew they were being watched. They could feel the eyes of the Americans on them. It turned the exercise into a double-blind performance. They were practicing war against each other, while simultaneously trying to hide their true capabilities from the real enemy listening in the dark. This, in proximity, 3 nuclear-powered submarines operating in a relatively confined box of water, all running quiet, all listening, created a hydroacoustic environment of extreme complexity. The ocean was alive with noise, the thrashing of propellers, the active pings of sonar, the biological noise of whales, and the phantom echoes of steel moving through water. It was a chaotic soup of sound where a single misinterpretation could lead to disaster. For the crew of the Kursk, however, the morning of August 12th began with the routine discipline of the silent service. The submarine had performed flawlessly the previous day, successfully launching a Granite cruise missile armed with a dummy warhead that had acquired its target with terrifying precision. The mood on board was buoyant. Captain First Rank Gennady Lyashin, a bearded, imposing man who was beloved by his crew, had reported to Fleet Command that the ship was in excellent condition. They had proven the Kursk's claws were sharp. Now, they had to prove its stealth. The schedule for Saturday morning called for the final act of the exercise. Between 11:30 a.m. and 1:30 p.m., the Kursk was scheduled to fire 2 practice torpedoes at the Peter the Great. These were not live weapons. They carried no explosives. Instead, they were equipped with sensors to record the hit. But firing a torpedo is a violent event, even in practice. It requires the precise coordination of the entire ship. The boat must be brought to the correct depth and speed. The target solution must be calculated. The tube must be flooded. The pressure must be equalized. At 08:51 a.m., Captain Lyakin requested permission to conduct the torpedo firing exercise. The transmission was brief, professional, and routine. Request permission to load tubes. Target designated. The response from the flagship was immediate. Permission granted. Good hunting. That was the last voice communication the world would ever hear from the K-141 Kursk. For the next 2 hours, the submarine went silent. This was expected. They were entering combat mode. To simulate an attack, they had to disappear. Lyashin ordered the boat to descend to periscope depth, hovering just below the waves. The crew moved with practiced efficiency. In the control room, the red battle lights would have been engaged, bathing the faces of the officers in a crimson glow. The air would have been thick with the focused intensity of men doing dangerous work. In the galley, cooks were likely preparing the midday meal, borscht, perhaps, or cutlets, unaware that the timeline of their lives had shrunk to minutes. In the first compartment, the torpedo room, the activity was frantic. The weapon selected for the exercise was the Fat Girl, the massive Type 6576 torpedo. The torpedo men, young conscripts and warrant officers, began the complex procedure of loading the weapon into the tube. This was heavy manual labor combined with delicate engineering. The torpedo weighed tons. It was slick with grease and cold to the touch. It smelled of machine oil and the sharp chemical tang of its fuel. The tragic irony of the War Games chapter is found in this specific moment. The entire purpose of the exercise was to demonstrate strength. The Kursk was there to show that Russia had mastered the art of war. The admirals on the Peter the Great were waiting to be impressed. The American spies on the Memphis and Toledo were waiting to be intimidated. The world was watching the Northern Fleet flex its muscles. But the true enemy was not the Americans. It was not the NATO alliance. It was not even the difficulty of the ocean. The true enemy was internal. It was the legacy of the 1990s, the years of neglect, the corners cut, the budget slashed. The Kursk was a shiny new wrapper on a military infrastructure that was rotting from the inside out. The torpedo they were loading was an old design, welding using cheap materials, maintained by underpaid technicians. The war game was a simulation of a high-tech future, but it was being fought with the dangerous relics of the past. As the clock ticked toward 11:28 a.m., the Peter the Great continued its patrol, its hydrophones listening for the telltale whoosh of a practice torpedo launch. The sailors on the deck enjoyed the crisp Arctic air. The sea was calm. The sun was trying to break through the high, thin clouds. It was a beautiful day for a war game. On the Kursk, the loading procedure was nearing completion. The inner door of the torpedo tube was secured. The flooding sequence began. The chemical components of the fuel sat inside the casing, separated by rubber seals that had degraded over years of storage. The stage was perfectly set. The actors had hit their marks. The audience was seated. The grand demonstration of Russian power was about to reach its climax. But instead of a display of might, the Barents Sea was about to witness a demonstration of physics. The war game was over. This reality was about to begin. The silence of the deep was not a strategic advantage anymore. It was the quiet before the annihilation. The pride of the fleet was not hunting, it was dissolving. And in the final seconds before 11:28, as the microscopic crack in the torpedo casing finally gave way, the 118 men on board moved from being soldiers in a simulation to victims in a tragedy that would freeze the world's blood. Chapter 4: The Fat Girl In. The lexicon of the Russian Navy, objects of destruction are often given affectionate, almost human nicknames. The sailors of the Northern Fleet, men who lived their lives in close proximity to the machinery of death, had a tendency to humanize the weapons they served. It was a coping mechanism, a way to domesticate the terrifying power that slept in the racks next to their bunks. And in the first compartment of the K-141 Kursk, the largest and most temperamental of these sleeping giants was known as Tolstaya Devushka, the Fat Girl. Her official designation was the Type 6576 Kit, whale. She was a relic of a different era, a monster born in the paranoid laboratories of the 1970s Soviet Union. While the Kursk itself was a masterpiece of modern stealth and digital integration, the Type 6576 was a brute. It was designed with a singular crude philosophy. If you cannot be smarter than the American aircraft carriers, you must be bigger, faster, and more violent. And the Fat Girl was undeniably big. Most torpedoes are sleek, needle-like instruments. The standard NATO torpedo, the Mark 48, is 533 mm, 21 inches, in diameter. The Type 6576 was a massive 650 mm, 26 inches, wide. It was over 11 meters long. It weighed nearly 5 tons. To look at it sitting in the rack was to look at a piece of industrial architecture rather than a missile. It dominated the torpedo room, a grey, greasy cylinder of steel that required heavy hydraulic chains and the sweat of half a dozen men to move. But it wasn't the size of the torpedo that made seasoned engineers nervous. It was the blood that ran through its veins. To propel a 5-ton weapon through the water at speeds capable of catching a nuclear carrier, speeds approaching 50 knots, batteries were not enough. Traditional electric motors were too heavy and too weak. The Soviet engineers needed raw, unadulterated power. They needed a chemical reaction that could generate massive thrust instantly. They chose a fuel that most of the world had abandoned decades earlier. High-test peroxide, HTP, is a substance that occupies a strange, terrifying middle ground between a fuel and an explosive. Chemically, it is hydrogen peroxide, the same innocent liquid found in brown bottles in medicine cabinets across the world, used to clean scraped knees and bleach hair. But in a medicine cabinet, the concentration is perhaps 3%. The rest is water. Inside the fuel tank of the Fat Girl, the concentration was closer to 85 or 98%. At this level of purity, hydrogen peroxide ceases to be a disinfectant. It becomes a starving molecular beast. It is an oxidizer of extreme violence. It desperately wants to return to a stable state, and to do so, it needs to get rid of an oxygen atom. All it requires is an excuse, a catalyst. That catalyst can be almost anything: a speck of dust, a drop of oil, a bit of rust, silver or copper. When HTP touches a catalyst, it doesn't burn in the traditional sense. It decomposes. The reaction is 2H, 2O cut 2, or right arrow, 2H cut 2O, plus O put 2, plus, untext, heat NOS. This formula looks dry on a chalkboard, but in the physical world it is catastrophic. The liquid instantly transforms into superheated steam and pure oxygen gas. The expansion ratio is 5,000 to 1. A single thimble of liquid becomes 5,000 thimbles of expanding gas in the blink of an eye. In a controlled engine, like the propulsion system of the torpedo, this gas is channeled through a turbine to spin the propellers with incredible force. It allows the torpedo to sprint through the ocean without leaving a wake of exhaust bubbles, making it wakeless and nearly impossible to dodge. However, the Western navies, the British and the Americans, had learned the hard lesson of HTP long ago. In 1955, the British submarine HMS Sidon sank in harbour when an HTP torpedo known as the Fancy exploded in the tube. The Royal Navy declared the fuel too volatile to handle. They prioritised safety over speed. They switched to safer, albeit slower, fuels. Better to be slow than dead was the NATO doctrine. The Soviet Union and later Russia made a different calculation. They were the underdogs. They were surrounded. They needed the speed. They needed the range. And so they kept the HTP torpedoes. They convinced themselves that with rigorous maintenance, strict protocols, and disciplined crews, the Fat Girl could be tamed. They believed that the danger could be managed by procedure, but by August 2000, procedure in the Russian Navy was a concept that had been eroded by a decade of poverty. The torpedo that was loaded into tube number 4 on the Kursk was not a factory-fresh weapon. It was an older model, manufactured in 1990. For 10 years, it had been sitting in storage, moved from warehouse to warehouse, subjected to the humidity and temperature fluctuations of the Arctic coast. Crucially, the casing of the torpedo was not a single seamless piece of metal. It was welded, and the welding on this particular batch of torpedoes was cheap. Investigations would later suggest that the welding seam on the fuel tank was microscopically flawed. Perhaps it was a tiny bubble in the metal, a grain of impurity left by a tired factory worker in Kyrgyzstan a decade prior. Perhaps the rubber seals, designed to keep the volatile HTP from touching the metal casing, had dried out and cracked after years of neglect. Whatever the initial cause, the result was a leak. It wasn't a gush. It wasn't a visible stream of liquid pouring onto the deck plates. It was likely a weep, a slow, molecular migration of the HTP seeping through the compromised seal. At 11:28 a.m., inside the number 4 torpedo tube, the environment was changing. The tube was a sealed steel cylinder. As the Kursk maneuvered for its practice shot, the HTP began to drip onto the torpedo casing. It found what it was looking for. Perhaps it was the kerosene fuel it was mixed with. Perhaps it was a patch of rust on the inside of the tube. Perhaps it was the grease on the loading mechanism. The catalyst made contact. Inside the microscopic world of the chemical leak, the temperature skyrocketed. The HTP began to decompose. It hissed into steam. The pressure inside the torpedo casing began to rise. This was the fat girl waking up. She was expanding. The casing of the dummy warhead, which was supposed to be inert, was suddenly being pressurized from the inside by a runaway chemical reaction. In the torpedo room, the crew was oblivious. There were 7 men in the first compartment at that moment. They were busy. The air was loud with the hum of ventilation and the hydraulic groans of the ship. They couldn't hear the hiss inside the sealed tube. They couldn't smell the acrid metallic tang of the reaction because it was contained behind inches of reinforced steel. They were standing next to a bomb that had already lit its own fuse. The tragedy of the Type 6576 is that it was a weapon that required perfection to be safe, deployed by a system that had forgotten what perfection looked like. The Torpedo was a high-performance race car engine being maintained by mechanics who hadn't been paid in months, using spare parts found in a scrap heap. It was a collision of high ambition and low resources. As the pressure inside the casing reached critical mass, the physics of the situation became simple. The steel of the torpedo body could withstand a certain amount of pressure. The HTP reaction was generating infinitely more. Something had to give. At 11:28:27, the structural integrity of the Fat Girl failed. The casing ruptured. The kerosene tank and the HTP tank, which were supposed to mix only in the combustion chamber, suddenly mixed in the open air of the torpedo tube. This was not the big explosion. This was the match. The resulting blast was the equivalent of about 100 kilograms of TNT. In the open air, this would have been a large bomb. Inside the confined pressurized steel tube of a submarine, it was a directed charge. It blew the back door of the torpedo tube off its hinges. The Fat Girl had spoken. And in doing so, she had turned the first compartment of the Kursk into an inferno. But she was not done. She had merely cleared the throat of the disaster. The true horror was that she was not alone in the room. Lined up in the racks, row upon row, were her sisters, and they were listening. The heat from the first blast was now washing over them, cooking their fuel, destabilizing their warheads, preparing them for the sympathetic detonation that would tear the world apart. The Fat Girl was the spark. The rest of the torpedo room was the powder keg, and the fuse had burned down to 0. Chapter 5, 11:28 M. The universe operates on a schedule defined by physics, and on the morning of August 12, 2000, the timeline of the K-141 Kursk was synchronized to a chemical reaction taking place inside a sealed steel tube. The crew in the command center, separated from the torpedo room by layers of steel and machinery, was operating on human time. They were watching clocks, checking schedules, and anticipating the lunch rotation. But in the first compartment, the clock had stopped ticking and had begun to scream. At exactly 11:28 and 27 seconds, the weep of high-test peroxide inside the casing of the Type 6576 torpedo found its catalyst. The kerosene fuel tank, corroded or compromised by a microscopic flaw in the welding, surrendered its integrity. The two liquids mixed. In the open air, such a mixture would result in a violent, uncontained fireball. But inside the thick, reinforced steel barrel of the torpedo tube, the reaction was something far more sinister. It was a directed energy event. The expansion of gas was instantaneous and exponential, a pressure spike that defied the structural limits of the material world. The casing of the torpedo shattered. This was the first event. It was not the apocalypse, not yet. The energy released was equivalent to roughly 100 kilograms of TNT. In the context of modern naval warfare, this is a significant but survivable detonation. If it had happened outside the hull, in the open water, the Kursk might have shuddered, taken damage, and limped home. But it happened inside. The force of the blast had nowhere to go but out. It blew the heavy inner door of the torpedo tube off its hinges, turning a piece of steel weighing hundreds of pounds into a supersonic projectile that ricocheted through the compartment like a pinball in a machine made of flesh and bone. The men in the first compartment, the torpedo men, the warrant officers, the sailors preparing the weapon, never stood a chance. They were not killed by the fire or the drowning that would come later. They were dismantled by the overpressure. The shockwave that filled the room was a physical hammer, a wall of air moving faster than the speed of sound, that liquefied internal organs and shattered skeletons before the brain could process the flash of light. The atmosphere in the room instantly transformed into a superheated aerosol of atomized kerosene and oxygen. A fire, ferocious and blinding, erupted in the confined space, consuming the air and replacing it with a toxic, searing smoke. But the horror of 11:28 a.m. is not just about the men who died in that first second. It is about the men who survived it. In the command center, located in the second compartment just behind the torpedo room, the explosion was felt as a dull, heavy thud. It was a sensation that no submariner ever wants to feel, the ship kicking against the water, a shudder that vibrated through the deck plates and into the soles of their feet. The lights would have flickered. Dust, accumulated in the overhead pipes and cable runs over years of service, would have rained down like grey snow. Captain Liakin and his officers were suddenly plunged into a nightmare scenario. The intercom system connected to the bow went dead. The sensors in the first compartment flatlined or screamed error messages. They were blind. They were deaf. But they were still alive. The bulkheads between the compartments were built to withstand immense pressure, and for a few fleeting moments, they held. The fire was contained in the nose of the ship. However, the physics of the Kursk had fundamentally changed. The blast had not just killed the crew in the bow. It had breached the hull. The integrity of the first compartment was gone. Water, the freezing, high-pressure water of the Barents Sea, began to rush in through the shattered torpedo tube. But it wasn't just water. It was an influx of mass. The delicate buoyancy of the submarine, carefully balanced to keep it hovering at periscope depth, was instantly destroyed. The nose of the ship became heavy, terribly, fatally heavy. The Kursk began to dip. The bow dropped. The massive propellers at the stern, still, spinning, were now driving the ship not forward, but downward. The submarine began a terminal dive, a slow-motion fall toward the seabed that the autopilot fought in vain to correct. The planes jammed. The ballast systems, overwhelmed by the sudden intake of ocean, could not compensate. The Leviathan was dying. On the surface, the event registered as a seismic anomaly. In Norway, at the Norsar Seismic Array, sensitive instruments designed to detect nuclear tests picked up a spike. It was small, magnitude 1.5 on the Richter scale. To a geologist, it looked like a minor earth tremor, a shifting of rocks on the ocean floor. But to the sonar operators on the American submarines Memphis and Toledo, lurking miles away, it was unmistakable. They heard the sharp crack of the explosion, followed by the groaning of steel under stress. They heard the sound of a submarine in distress. On the bridge of the flagship Pyotr Veliky, the crew felt a shudder. It was a vibration that traveled through the water and rang the hull of the heavy cruiser. Officers looked at each other. Was that the torpedo launch? Was that the sound of the engine starting? Or was it something else? The report went up the chain of command. Detected underwater acoustic event. But there was no fireball on the surface. There was no debris field. There was just the grey ocean, rolling on as it had for 1 billion years. The exercise continued. The admirals checked their watches, waiting for the radio report from Liachin that the target had been engaged. They didn't know that the man they were waiting to hear from was currently fighting for his life in a ship that was tilting 20 degrees down, sliding into the dark. Inside the Kursk, the time between 11:28:27 and 11:30:42 became a distinct, agonizing era. It is a period of 135 seconds, 2 minutes and 15 seconds. In our daily lives, this is nothing. It is the time it takes to brew a cup of coffee. It is the length of a commercial break. But on the submarine, it was an eternity. This period is known as the interregnum. It is the gap between the injury and the death. As the ship dove, the fire in the first compartment was not extinguished by the rushing water. Instead, it was fed. The HTP reaction generates its own oxygen. It does not need air to burn. It burns underwater. It burns in a vacuum. The fire raged with the intensity of a blast furnace, temperatures reaching over 2,000 degrees Celsius. The steel of the torpedo racks began to glow cherry red, then white hot. And sitting in those racks, bathed in this inferno, were the other torpedoes. The fat girl had sisters. 21 other weapons were stored in the first compartment. Some were standard electric torpedoes. Others were warshot-ready missiles. As the temperature in the room climbed past the melting point of steel, the warheads of these weapons began to cook, the explosives inside them highly stable military-grade compounds. Designed to be safe during transport, were being subjected to heat they were never meant to endure. Their chemical bonds were vibrating, stretching, reaching the breaking point. In the second compartment, the command crew must have realized the severity of the situation. The angle of the deck was steepening. Books, charts, and coffee cups would have been sliding off the consoles, crashing against the forward bulkhead. The air conditioning vents would have stopped blowing cool air and started circulating the acrid smell of smoke that was seeping through the seals. Liachin would have been shouting orders, trying to blow the emergency ballast tanks, trying to surface the boat. Emergency surface, all back full. But the ship was too heavy. The laws of buoyancy had been revoked. The Kursk was a stone. This is the true horror of the first event. It wasn't the end. It was the warning. It was the moment when the crew realized that the unsinkable ship was fallible. For 135 seconds, they were alive to process their own doom. They could feel the heat rising through the bulkhead. They could hear the roaring of the fire in the bow, a sound like a jet engine screaming inside a cave. They could hear the groaning of the hull as the depth gauge spun deeper and deeper. 50 meters, 60 meters, 70 meters. They were falling toward the bottom. And they were sitting on top of a bomb that was priming itself. The seismic data tells us exactly how long they had. We can see the first spike at 11:28:27. And then there is a flat line, a pause, a silence on the graph that represents the desperate struggle of 118 men trying to save their ship. It represents the frantic turning of valves, the shouting of commands, the prayers whispered in the dark. It represents the realization that the fire forward was not going out. As the Kursk approached the seabed, the heat in the first compartment reached the critical threshold. The 5-2-7 combat-ready torpedoes, their warheads now superheated to the point of instability, reached their flashpoint simultaneously. The universe, having paused for 2 minutes to allow the horror to sink in, pressed the play button again. The chemistry of the high explosives surrendered. The first event had been a grenade. The second event, approaching at the speed of light, was going to be a volcano. At 11:30 and 42 seconds, the Kursk hit the bottom, or perhaps it was just before it hit. The timing is a blur of physics and destruction, but the result was absolute. The interregnum was over. The dull thud was about to be replaced by a sound that would circle the globe. The fat girl had spoken, but now the entire choir was about to sing. And the men in the command center, who had spent the last 2 minutes fighting to save their vessel, were about to be erased from history. Chapter 6. The Earthquake. If the first explosion was a warning, a sharp, violent slap to the face of the Northern Fleet, the second explosion was an execution. The 135 seconds of the interregnum had ended. The timeline of uncertainty was over. At 11:30 and 42 seconds, the physics of the disaster shifted from a localized chemical fire to a cataclysmic release of energy that would register on geological instruments on the other side of the planet. Inside the shattered remains of the first compartment, the temperature had climbed beyond the realm of industrial tolerance. The fire, fed by the oxygen-rich decomposition of the high-test peroxide, had turned the torpedo room into a kiln. The steel racks holding the remaining weapons were glowing white-hot. The warheads inside those weapons, unstable cocktails of high explosives designed to break the keels of aircraft carriers, were vibrating at a molecular level. They were cooking, and unlike the Fat Girl, which had merely burst its casing, these weapons were about to do exactly what they were designed to do. It is believed that between 5 and 7 torpedoes detonated simultaneously. The human mind has difficulty comprehending the speed of high explosives. We are accustomed to things happening in real time, the time it takes for a glass to fall, a car to brake, a person to blink. But a detonation does not happen in real time. It happens in microtime. The velocity of detonation for modern naval explosives is roughly 8,000 meters per second. That is 23 times the speed of sound. It is a speed so fast that the explosion is over before the light from the flash can reach the retina of a human eye standing a few feet away. When those warheads triggered, they did not just explode, they erased the front of the submarine. The combined force of the blast was estimated to be between 2 and 3 tons of TNT. In the open air, a blast of this magnitude would level a city block. It would shatter windows for miles. It would create a mushroom cloud visible from the horizon. But this did not happen in the open air. It happened inside a sealed, pressurized steel tube, submerged in a non-compressible fluid. The result was a phenomenon known as containment. The energy had nowhere to go. It could not dissipate into the atmosphere. Instead, it was focused entirely on the structure of the Kursk. The explosion transformed the first compartment into a rapidly expanding bubble of superheated gas and plasma. The pressure spiked to tens of thousands of atmospheres in a fraction of a millisecond. The effect was not like a bomb going off in a room. It was like a shotgun going off inside a flute. The heavy steel bulkhead separating the torpedo room from the command center, a wall of metal designed to withstand the crushing pressure of the deep ocean, vaporized. It didn't buckle. It didn't bend. It simply ceased to exist as a solid barrier. The shockwave, moving at hypersonic velocity, tore through it as if it were made of wet tissue paper. This brings us to the command center in the second compartment. This was the brain of the ship. It was where Captain Gennady Lyakhin and the senior officers had spent the last 2 minutes frantically trying to save their vessel. They were surrounded by the most advanced technology the Russian Federation possessed. They were the elite. But in the face of the second event, rank and technology meant nothing. The shockwave entered the second compartment faster than the nerve impulses could travel from the officers' ears to their brains. They were dead before they heard the sound. They were dead before their bodies could register the sensation of heat or pain. The command center was scoured clean. The periscopes were sheared off. The heavy machinery, the sonar consoles, the plotting tables, everything was shredded into shrapnel and propelled backward into the ship. The brain of the Kursk was lobotomized in less than 1/10 of a second. But the horror of the second event was not limited to the blast wave alone. It was the water. When the nose of the submarine was blown open, the ocean rushed in. But it didn't rush in like a flooding river. It rushed in like a solid piston. The water, driven by the immense pressure of the explosion and the depth, entered the breach at hundreds of miles per hour. It acted as a hydraulic ram. This massive plug of water hammered through the wreckage of the first and second compartments, pushing the debris and the air ahead of it. This created a secondary compression wave, an air hammer. As the water piston drove backward, it compressed the air in the remaining compartments until the air itself became a weapon. The bulkhead separating the second and third compartments failed. Then, the third and fourth. The destruction moved down the length of the ship like a domino effect of annihilation. In the third compartment, which housed the radio room and the electronic warfare suites, the crew would have been obliterated instantly by the debris from the command center slamming into them. In the fourth compartment, the living quarters, the city beneath the sea, was turned into a twisted junkyard. The gym, the sauna, the officers' mess, all of it was crushed, twisted, and filled with the freezing, violent sludge of the Barents Sea. The shockwave continued its journey aft. It hit the fifth and fifth best compartments. This was the energy heart of the ship, the nuclear reactors. Here, the engineering of the Soviet Union finally held its ground against the physics of destruction. The bulkheads surrounding the reactor compartment were built stronger than anything else on the ship. They were designed to survive a direct hit. As the shockwave slammed into the front wall of the reactor compartment, the steel groaned, deformed, and bowed inward, but it did not break. The wave of death that had consumed the first half of the ship was finally stopped. Inside the reactor control room, the shock was massive. The sheer G-force of the impact would have thrown the engineers across the room. Equipment would have been torn from the walls, but the reactors themselves, sensing the catastrophic acceleration, initiated an automatic emergency shutdown. The control rods were slammed home by gravity and spring-loaded mechanisms. The scram was successful. In the midst of the apocalypse, the nuclear hearts of the Kursk went to sleep. This single mechanical triumph prevented the disaster from becoming a radioactive environmental catastrophe that could have poisoned the Arctic for decades. But while the internal destruction was terrifying, the external signature of the explosion was global. Thousands of miles away, in the quiet forests of Norway, the seismometers at the Norsar Institute jumped. The needles scribbled frantically across the paper drums. The analysts on duty saw the spike immediately, a magnitude 4.2 seismic event. A 4.2 earthquake is not trivial. It is enough to rattle dishes in a cupboard. It is enough to wake you from a deep sleep. But this earthquake did not come from a fault line. It came from a single point in the ocean. The data was unequivocal. The location was 69 degrees north, 37 degrees east. The same coordinates where, just 2 minutes earlier, they had detected the smaller 1.5 magnitude pop. The analysts knew what they were looking at. Earthquakes rumble. They build up and taper off. Explosions are sharp. They arrive all at once. This was an explosion, and judging by the energy required to generate a 4.2 signal through the Earth's crust, it was massive. They calculated the yield. It wasn't just a torpedo. It was a magazine detonation. Back in the Barents Sea, the surface of the ocean shuddered. The flagship Pyotr Veliki, cruising miles away, was rocked by the concussion. This wasn't a vibration. It was a kick. Sailors on the deck stumbled. The hull of the giant battlecruiser rang like a bell. Below decks, the sonar operators tore their headphones off as a deafening roar washed out their senses. The ocean, usually a chaotic mix of background noise, was suddenly dominated by a single, overwhelming acoustic slam. And then, silence. The Kursk, now a broken corpse of a ship, settled onto the seabed. The nose was gone, replaced by a jagged maw of torn steel. The first 4 compartments were flooded, crushed, and lifeless. The reactor compartment was dark. The ship lay at a slight angle, half buried in the silt that had been kicked up by the impact. The city beneath the sea was dead, or so it seemed. The second event had done its work. It had killed the majority of the crew. It had destroyed the command structure. It had silenced the engines and the reactors. It had alerted the world that something terrible had happened, but the physics of the explosion had been directional. The blast had moved aft, losing energy with every bulkhead it smashed through. By the time it hit the reactor wall, it was spent. Behind that wall, in the tail of the ship, the laws of physics had been slightly kinder. The shockwave that reached the rear compartments, 6, 7, 8, and 9, was not a liquefying hammer. It was a violent car crash level impact. In the turbine room, compartment 7, and the escape trunk, compartment 9, the men were thrown from their feet. Lights shattered. Pipes burst. Smoke filled the air. But they were not vaporized. They were not crushed. They were shaken, bruised, terrified, and deafened. But they were breathing. The second event was the dividing line. Before 11:30:42, the Kursk was a submarine in distress. After 11:30:42, the Kursk was a tomb, but it was a tomb with a pocket of air. As the cloud of silt slowly began to settle around the wreck, burying the devastation in a soft grey blanket, the seismographs in Norway went quiet. The echoes faded in the distance. The ocean returned to its ambient rumble. But inside the steel carcass, deep in the stern, flashlights were clicking on. Voices were calling out names in the dark. The explosion had taken everything from them: their captain, their friends, their power, their hope of fighting back. But it had left them one thing. It had left them time. The earthquake was over. The long, silent nightmare of the wait was about to begin. The world above was still debating whether an accident had occurred. The admirals were still scanning the horizon for a periscope. But 108 meters down, 23 men were realizing that they were the last souls left alive in hell. Chapter 7. The Silence. On the surface of the Barents Sea, the world had not ended. To the casual observer standing on the deck of a support ship, or perhaps a fisherman navigating the grey waters miles away, the morning of August 12th remained stubbornly, infuriatingly normal. The sky was a low, heavy blanket of stratus clouds. The wind was light, barely whipping the whitecaps. The sea state was calm, a deceptive mirror that reflected nothing but the indifference of the natural world. Physics had just torn a hole in the universe 100 meters down, releasing enough energy to register on seismographs halfway around the globe, yet the interface between the ocean and the air remained unbroken. There was no geyser of water. There was no mushroom cloud. There was no oil slick spreading like a black bruise, at least not yet. There was only silence, but it was not a peaceful silence. It was a silence defined by what was missing. It was a negative space in the electromagnetic spectrum, a void where there should have been data, reports, and the reassuring chatter of military competence. At 11:30:42, the exact moment the Kursk ceased to exist as a fighting vessel, the flagship Pyotr Veliky was cruising roughly 30 miles away. The nuclear battlecruiser, the largest surface combatant on Earth, was the nerve center of the exercise. On its bridge, Admiral Vyacheslav Popov, the commander of the Northern Fleet, was overseeing the war game. When the shockwave from the second explosion hit the cruiser, it was unmistakable. The massive hull, displacing 28,000 tons, rang like a struck bell. It was a sharp, violent shudder that travelled up through the keel, vibrating the deck plates and rattling the coffee cups in the officers' wardroom. The reaction on the bridge was immediate but confused. A report came in from the hydroacoustic station. Registered underwater acoustic event, bearing distance, heavy fluctuation. In a different navy, or perhaps in a different era, this might have triggered an immediate general quarters alarm. A magnitude 4.2 explosion is not subtle. It sounds like war, but the mindset of the Northern Fleet in August 2000 was not wired for catastrophe. It was wired for denial. The psychology of the Russian military at the turn of the millennium was a complex tapestry of pride, fear, and rigid adherence to the script. The script said that the Kursk was firing a practice torpedo. The script said that the exercise was a success. The script did not account for the unthinkable. Admiral Popov, standing on the bridge, reportedly felt the shudder. He turned to his officers. One suggested it might be the submarine blowing its tanks violently. Another suggested it was part of the weapon launch signature, perhaps a particularly enthusiastic solid rocket booster igniting underwater. A third theory was that the Kursk had collided with an external object, perhaps the American submarine they knew was lurking nearby. But no one said the word sinking. No one said explosion. To admit that possibility was to invite a reality that none of them could handle. And so, the order was given to wait. The fleet continued its patrol. The admiral returned to his observation post. The shudder was noted in the log, but it was not flagged as an emergency. It was treated as an anomaly, a glitch in the simulation. This decision, the decision to do nothing, marked the beginning of the silence. It was a period of bureaucratic paralysis that would last for nearly 12 hours. The first missed deadline arrived quickly. According to the exercise plan, the Kursk was scheduled to complete its torpedo firing run by 1:30 p.m. At that time, Captain Lyakin was supposed to surface, or at least come to periscope depth, and radio the flagship. Target engaged. Exercise complete. 1:30 p.m. came and went. The radio channels remained filled with static. On the Pyotr Veliki, the communications, officers sat at their consoles, headsets pressed to their ears, listening to the white noise. They adjusted the gain. They switched frequencies. They checked the backup channels. Nothing. Just the hiss of the ionosphere and the crackle of cosmic background radiation. The check-in time passed. In the rigid hierarchy of naval command, a missed check-in is a serious infraction, but it is not necessarily a disaster. Submarines are, by their very nature, elusive. Perhaps Lyakin had found a hole in the water layers and was staying deep to evade detection for extra credit. Perhaps his radio antenna was malfunctioning. Perhaps he was maintaining radio silence to simulate a combat evasion profile. There were a dozen excuses available to the admirals, and they seized upon every one of them rather than face the truth. The minutes turned into hours. The sun began its slow, low arc across the Arctic sky. Below the surface, the Kursk was already a tomb. The fires in the bow were likely dying down as the water flooded the compartments, cooling the twisted steel. The silt was settling. In the 9th compartment, the 23 survivors were beginning their long, cold wait, likely wondering why they couldn't hear the screws of rescue ships buzzing overhead. They didn't know that above them, the fleet was still sailing in circles, pretending that everything was fine. By 5 p.m., the silence had shifted from annoying to ominous. This was the deadline for the Kursk to surface and report its position before the fleet turned back towards Severomorsk. The exercise was officially winding down. Helicopters were landing on the cruisers. The debriefing sessions were being scheduled, but there was still no sign of the submarine. Commander Popov and his staff began to feel the cold creep of panic. They started sending active signals. K-141, report position. K-141, acknowledge. The active sonar of the surface ships began to ping the ocean. Ping, ping, ping. The sound waves traveled down, bouncing off the thermoclayers, searching for the 18,000-ton hull. But the ocean is vast, and the Barents Sea is acoustically messy. The bottom is rocky and scarred. A silent submarine sitting on the seabed looks remarkably like a rock to a sonar operator who isn't sure what he is looking for. Or perhaps they did get returns, strange distorted echoes from a location where there shouldn't have been a submarine, and dismissed them as seabed anomalies. It wasn't until late that evening, around 11:30 p.m., a full 12 hours after the explosion, that the Northern Fleet officially declared an emergency. 12 hours. Half a day had been wasted. Half a day where the survivors had oxygen, heat, and hope. Half a day where rescue ships could have been mobilized. Half a day where the British and Norwegian navies, who had detected the seismic spikes instantly, could have been alerted and dispatched. But the silence was not just radio silence. It was political silence. The Russian Naval Command was paralyzed by a fear of the Kremlin. To report a lost submarine is to report a failure of the state. It is to admit that the resurgence of the Russian military was a sham. No admiral wanted to be the one to pick up the red phone and tell Moscow that the pride of the fleet was missing, and so they waited. They hoped that the Kursk would suddenly pop up on the horizon, Lyakin apologizing for a broken radio, and the nightmare would evaporate. They were bargaining with physics. They were hoping that if they ignored the silence long enough, it would go away. While the admirals paced the bridge of the Pyotr Veliki, a different kind of silence was descending on the town of Vidyaevo. This was the home base of the Kursk. It was a closed city, a collection of grey concrete apartment blocks carved out of the tundra, existing solely to support the submarine flotilla. In Vidyayevo, the wives knew. They didn't need a radio report. They didn't need a seismograph. They knew because the submarine telephone, the informal network of gossip and intuition that runs through every Navy town, was already ringing. Rumors were flying. The fleet is acting strange. Why haven't they radioed? Why are the helicopters taking off again? The silence in the apartments of Vidyayevo was heavy. Women sat by their phones, staring at them, willing them to ring. Children played on the floor, sensing the tension in their mothers' shoulders. The silence here was the suffocating pressure of the unknown. It was the silence of a kitchen where a place is set for dinner for a man who is currently 100 meters underwater, breathing air that is slowly turning into poison. This chapter of the story is the most infuriating because it is the chapter of human failure. The explosion was physics. It was a mechanical accident. The delay was a choice. The system was designed to protect secrets, not lives. The priority was to secure the perimeter, to control the narrative, to prevent the West from knowing that the carrier killer had killed itself. The active pinging continued into the night, desperate pulses of sound reaching down into the dark. Ping, down in the 9th compartment. Did they hear it? Sound travels well in water. If the surface ships were close enough, the survivors might have heard the ping of active sonar. To a trapped submariner, that sound is the voice of God. It means we see you. It means help is coming. Imagine the cruelty of that sound. Hearing the fleet searching for you, hearing the pings wash over the hull, and then nothing. No rescue vehicle latching on, no divers knocking back. Just the pings, continuing their search pattern, drifting away as the ships moved to a different sector, because they simply didn't believe the Kursk could be where it actually was. The sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the Arctic in a twilight gloom. The Barents Sea turned black. The silence on the radio frequencies became absolute. Finally, just before midnight, the denial broke. Admiral Popov sent the report to Moscow. The Kursk was declared lost. But even then, the lie continued. The official statement was not, "The submarine has exploded." The official statement was that the Kursk had technical difficulties and had descended to the ocean floor. They used soft language. They said communication had been established with the crew. A lie. They said air was being pumped in. A lie. They claimed the situation was under control. This was the silence of the cover-up. It was a silence that would wrap around the world, baffling international experts who looked at the seismic data and saw a violent explosion, while the Russian spokespeople spoke of minor collisions. As Chapter 7 closes, the situation shifts from a military exercise to a hostage crisis. But the hostages were not held by terrorists. They were held by the ocean and by their own government's pride. The elite clock had been ticking for 12 hours. The oxygen in the 9th compartment was being consumed with every breath. The temperature was dropping, and on the surface, the only thing louder than the missing radio signals was the roar of the lies beginning to take shape. The world was about to wake up to the tragedy, but for the men of the Kursk, the long night had already begun. They were no longer sailors. They were secrets buried in the mud. And the silence above them was becoming a lid on their coffin, sealed tight by the fear of admitting the truth. Chapter 8, Compartment 9. The explosion that tore the bow off the Kursk was a singular violent event, a thunderclap of physics that registered on seismographs across the hemisphere. But for the men in the tail of the submarine, the horror was not the noise. It was the sudden, crushing realization that the noise had stopped. After the shockwave of the second explosion dissipated, slamming against the reinforced bulkhead of the reactor, a compartment and dying out in a tangle of twisted steel, a new acoustic reality settled over the wreck. It was the silence of the grave. The humming vibration of the turbines was gone. The rhythmic thrum of the propellers was gone. The ventilation systems, which had provided a constant white noise of life for the entirety of the voyage, were dead. The Kursk, once a living organism of pumps, fans, and reactors, had become a static object, a corpse of steel settling into the silt of the Barents Sea floor. In the aftermath of the cataclysm, the laws of survival on board the submarine changed instantly. The front of the ship, the torpedo room, the command center, the living quarters, was gone, obliterated by the thermal and kinetic violence of the warheads. The men stationed there had ceased to exist in the span of a single heartbeat, but the back of the ship was different. The K-141 was designed with a grim redundancy. The reactor compartment, Compartment 5, acted as a massive, structural shield. Its walls were thicker, its construction denser. It had absorbed the blow, protecting the stern from the immediate annihilation that had consumed the bow. In the compartments behind the reactor, 6, 7, 8, and 9, life flickered in the darkness. These were the engineering spaces. Compartment 6 housed the control systems for the nuclear reactors. Compartment 7 contained the massive steam turbines that drove the propellers. Compartment 8 was the auxiliary machinery room, and Compartment 9 was the steering gear room and the escape trunk. When the dust settled and the emergency lights flickered on, casting a sickly dim orange glow over the smoke-filled corridors, the survivors began to move. They were deafened, bleeding, and concussed. The shockwave had thrown them against machinery and bulkheads with the force of a car crash. Bones were broken, eardrums were ruptured, but the training kicked in. The instinct of the submariner is not to run, but to seal. In the reactor control room, the officers had already performed the most important act of their lives. They had ensured the reactors were shut down. They checked the rods. They checked the radiation sensors. Then, realizing the air was becoming toxic with smoke and that the ship was dead, they moved aft. They moved away from the devastation. They moved toward the only hope they had left. The migration was slow and painful. Men stumbled through the tilted corridors. The ship had settled on the bottom with a list, and the floor was now a slippery angled slope covered in oil, debris, and shattered glass. From Compartment 6, they climbed through the circular hatch into Compartment 7, from 7 into 8, and finally into 9. They were retreating. They were falling back to the safe zone. Compartment 9 is the tail of the Scorpion. It is the very end of the submarine. Physically, it is not a large space. It is dominated by the massive hydraulic rams that move the rudders and the hydroplanes. It is crowded with machinery, pipes, and valves. But it holds the most precious piece of equipment on a sunken submarine, the aft escape trunk. This is a vertical steel tube that leads up through the double hull to the open ocean. It is the exit door. As the survivors tumbled into the room, the crowd grew. First came the men who were already stationed there, the mechanics and electricians of the stern watch. Then came the refugees from the turbine room. Then the officers from the reactor room. They counted heads. There were 23 of them. 23 men out of a crew of 118. They were a mix of ranks and ages. There was Captain Lieutenant Dmitri Kolesnikov, a 27-year-old officer with a calm demeanor and a sharp mind. There was Captain Lieutenant Rashid Aryapov. There were warrant officers, midshipmen and sailors who had been in the Navy for less than a year. They were the lucky ones, or so they thought. Once everyone was inside, the heavy steel wheel of the bulkhead door was spun shut. The dogs latched. The seal was compressed. With that action, they severed their connection to the rest of the ship. They locked out the water that was slowly flooding the forward compartments. They locked out the radiation, should the reactors eventually fail. But they also locked themselves in. The atmosphere inside Compartment 9 was heavy with the smell of disaster. It is a specific scent, known to those who work with heavy machinery and high voltage. It is the smell of ozone from fried electrical circuits, the cloying sweetness of hydraulic fluid, the sharp tang of burnt insulation, and the metallic taste of adrenaline. The air was already starting to cool. The reactors were the beating heart of the ship, providing not just power but heat. With the reactors dead, the submarine was quickly becoming the same temperature as the surrounding ocean, 4 degrees Celsius. The emergency lights were battery-powered. They would not last forever. The darkness was already gathering in the corners of the room, a physical weight pressing in on the men. In this claustrophobic steel box, barely large enough for 23 men to stand, let alone sit or sleep, a hierarchy emerged. Panic is the enemy of survival. In a sealed environment, oxygen is currency, and panic burns it too fast. Dmitri Kolesnikov took charge. He was the senior officer in the compartment, and by all accounts, he embodied the stoic discipline of the service. He began the roll call. It was a ritual of confirmation, a way of proving that they were still individuals, not just ghosts in a wreck. He pulled a piece of paper from a notebook, perhaps a maintenance log, perhaps a personal diary, and he began to write. 1. Kovalev, V. 2. Danica, V. 3. Slonimsky, O. He wrote the names of the men in the turbine room. 1. Sadkov, R. 2. Kubikov, R. 3. Sobolev, R. He wrote the names of the men from the reactor compartment. He listed them all. 23 souls. He noted their ranks. He noted their condition. This list, written in the fading light with a steady hand, was not just a census. It was an act of defiance against the chaos. It was an assertion of order. We are here. We are accounted for. But as the initial adrenaline faded, the reality of their situation began to set in. They were trapped. The escape trunk, the reason they had gathered in Compartment 9, was their primary hope. The plan was theoretical but sound. Put on thermal survival suits, climb into the trunk, pressurize it, open the outer hatch, and float to the surface. It was a procedure they had drilled, but drilling it in a simulator and doing it in a wrecked ship at 108 meters depth are two different things. We do not know exactly why they didn't leave immediately. Perhaps the trunk was damaged by the shockwave. Perhaps the pressure sensors indicated that the outer hatch was jammed by debris. Perhaps the water pressure at that depth was simply too high for the manual mechanisms to overcome without hydraulic assist. Or perhaps they made the calculation that the surface was too dangerous. To ascend from 100 meters without slow decompression is to risk the bends, embolisms, and death. Without a rescue ship waiting above to put them in a decompression chamber, a free ascent could be fatal. So they chose the alternative. They chose to wait. They knew the fleet was out there. They knew the Pyotr Velikiy was nearby. They assumed that the explosion had been heard, that the alarms were ringing, that the divers were already suiting up. They assumed the world was coming for them. They didn't know about the silence on the radio. They didn't know about the admirals debating in the wardroom. They didn't know they were political inconveniences. They settled in. The space was tight. To fit 23 men, they had to use every inch of available volume. Some sat on the cold steel deck plates, others perched on pipes and valve wheels. They were shoulder to shoulder, knee to knee. The physical intimacy was absolute. In the dark, you could hear the breathing of the man next to you. You could smell his fear, his sweat, his blood. The thermal management became the first crisis. The Kursk was losing heat rapidly. The steel hull was a massive heat sink, conducting the warmth of their bodies out into the infinite cold of the Arctic Ocean. The survivors put on whatever clothing they had: thick woolen submarine sweaters, thermal underwear, jackets. They huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat like animals in a burrow. Then came the issue of the air. A submarine is a sealed system. It requires machines to scrub carbon dioxide, CO2, from the air and add oxygen. Without power, the scrubbers were dead. The 23 men were exhaling poison with every breath. As CO2 builds up in a confined space, it acts as a narcotic. It makes you tired. It dulls the mind. Eventually, it kills you. To combat this, they found the emergency regeneration cartridges. These are chemical plates, usually containing potassium superoxide, that absorb CO2 and release oxygen when they react with the moisture in the air. They are lifesavers, but they are also dangerous. They are chemical fires waiting to happen. If they get wet with oil, they explode. If they are dropped into water, they react violently. The men hung the sheets carefully, watching them sway in the stagnant air. The silence of Compartment 9 was not total. It was punctuated by the groaning of the ship. As the hull settled into the seabed, the steel cried out. Bolts sheared. Plates shifted. Every creak and pop echoed through the compartment, freezing the hearts of the men inside. Was the bulkhead holding? Was the water rising? And the water was rising. Even though they had sealed the door, the Kursk was not watertight. The shockwave had likely compromised seals and valves throughout the stern. Water was seeping into the bilge of Compartment 9. It was oily, freezing, and black. It rose slowly, inch by inch, creeping up from the machinery spaces below the deck plates. It was a ticking clock, made of liquid. Kolesnikov and the other officers maintained discipline. They rationed the water bottles. They forbade unnecessary movement to conserve oxygen. They listened. They took turns at the hull. They found a heavy object, a hammer or a wrench, and they began to signal. SOS, SOS, SOS. They struck the steel ribs of the ship. The sound rang out, crisp and clear. They knew how sound travelled. They knew that if anyone was listening, they would hear it. They established a rhythm. They knocked, and then they stopped to listen for a response. Knock, knock, knock. Silence. Knock, knock, knock. Silence. This was the torture of Compartment 9. It was not the fire that had consumed their shipmates in the bow. It was the hope. If they had died instantly, there would have been no suffering, but they were alive. They were thinking. They were remembering their families. Dmitri Kolesnikov thought of his wife, Olga. He had a photo of her in his pocket. He thought of the life they were supposed to have. As the hours dragged on, the definition of time began to blur. In the pitch blackness, relieved only by the dying glow of a flashlight or the chemical luminescence of a light stick, minutes stretched into hours. The cold seeped into their marrow. The CO2 began to cloud their thoughts. The bravado of survival began to wear thin, replaced by a creeping, icy dread. The ninth compartment had transformed. It was no longer a room in a warship. It was a sarcophagus. It was a steel box at the bottom of the world, holding 23 men who were slowly realizing that the rescue mission they were imagining might not be real. Kolesnikov pulled out his notebook again. The light was fading. His hands were numb from the cold. The handwriting, which had been neat and precise during the roll call, began to degrade. It became jagged, scrawled in the dark. He wasn't writing a log anymore. He was writing a testament. It's dark here to write, but I'll try by feel. He was documenting the end. He was leaving a breadcrumb trail for the future, a voice from the void that would eventually indict the silence of the surface. But in that moment, in the crushing dark of Compartment 9, there was no audience. There was only the breathing of dying men, the drip of oily water, and the rhythmic, desperate clanging of a hammer against a wall that refused to open. The safe zone had become a trap, and the nightmare of the wait had truly begun. Chapter 9, 108, meters down. The measurement of depth is usually a sterile statistic. In the dry academic language of oceanography, 108 meters is classified as the epipelagic, or sunlight, zone. It is the shallowest layer of the ocean, a region where light can still penetrate, where photosynthesis occurs, and where the majority of marine life thrives. To a submarine designed to operate at crushed depths of 500 meters or more, sitting at 108 meters is technically akin to being parked in a driveway. It is shallow water. If a diver were to swim down from the surface on a clear day, they would be able to see the hull of the Kursk resting in the grey silt, illuminated by the faint filtered glow of the sun. But for the 23 men trapped inside the ninth compartment, 108 meters was not a statistic. It was a physical barrier that might as well have been the distance to the moon. The tragedy of the Kursk is often defined by its violence, the explosions, the fire, the twisted steel. But the horror of Chapter 9 is defined by its proximity. The survivors were not lost in the abyssal void of the Pacific. They were not stranded on the dark side of an alien planet. They were agonizingly close to the air. The submarine was 154 meters long. Resting on the seabed at an angle, the tail section was slightly elevated. The vertical distance between the escape hatch above their heads and the surface of the Barents Sea was less than the length of a football field. It was a distance that a strong swimmer could cover in 2 minutes. It was a distance that the radio waves of the BBC and the voice of the Russian president were currently traveling through, bouncing off the water just above them. This proximity transformed their imprisonment from a survival situation into a psychological torture chamber. They knew exactly where they were. They knew the charts. They knew that if they could just open the hatch and leave, they would be breathing fresh air before their lungs burst. But physics is a cruel jailer. At 108 meters, the pressure is approximately 11 atmospheres. That's roughly 160 pounds of pressure per square inch pressing down on the outer hatch. No human strength could push it open. The only way out was to equalize the pressure, to flood the escape, trunk. Let the water in until the pressure inside matched the pressure outside, and then swim out. But to swim out into 11 atmospheres of pressure without a decompression chamber waiting for you is suicide. The nitrogen in your blood would turn into bubbles the moment you surfaced, boiling your veins and killing you instantly with the bends. They were trapped by the very laws of nature they had spent their careers mastering. Inside the compartment, the environment was waging a war of attrition against their biology. The first enemy was the cold. The Barents Sea is not merely cold, it is a heat thief. The water temperature at that depth hovers around 4 degrees Celsius, 39 degrees Fahrenheit. With the nuclear reactors shut down and the steam turbines silent, the Kursk was no longer generating heat. The massive steel hull, which had previously been a warm, living skin, was now conducting the freezing temperature of the ocean directly into the compartment. The steel walls radiated cold. The floor plates became blocks of ice. The air inside the compartment began to cool rapidly, and as it cooled, the moisture from the men's breath condensed. A cold, damp fog began to fill the room. It was a thick, heavy mist that clung to their clothes and slicked their hair. The survivors huddled together in the darkness, pressing their bodies against one another in a desperate puppy pile to conserve thermal energy. They wore whatever they had grabbed in the chaos: thick wool submarine sweaters, thermal underlayers, greasy work overalls. But the cold was insidious. It seeped through the layers. It slowed the heart rate. It numbed the fingers and toes. Hypothermia is a slow, confused death. It starts with shivering, violent, uncontrollable shaking as the body burns its energy reserves to generate heat. Then comes the lethargy. The muscles stiffen. The mind begins to wander. In the pitch black of the 9th compartment, the men would have been fighting the urge to close, their eyes to drift off into a sleep that they would never wake up from. Dmitri Kolesnikov and the other officers likely kept them talking, kept them moving, forced them to stay awake. Check the pressure. Check the oxygen. Listen for the sound. The second enemy was the chemistry of the air. A human being is a machine that turns oxygen into carbon dioxide. In a sealed room, this process is a ticking clock. As the 23 men breathed, they were slowly turning their sanctuary into a gas chamber. The CO2 levels began to rise. Carbon dioxide poisoning is not like suffocation. It is a poisoning of the blood. It begins with a headache, a dull, throbbing pain behind the eyes. Then comes the dizziness, the shortness of breath, the feeling of panic. To combat this, they deployed the chemical regeneration plates. These were thin sheets of potassium superoxide, stored in metal canisters. When hung in the air, they absorb CO2 and release oxygen via a chemical reaction. They are the lifeline of a trapped submarine. But they are finicky, dangerous tools. The reaction generates heat. The plates get hot to the touch, and crucially, they must be kept dry. If they come into contact with water or oil, they react violently, sizzling and potentially igniting. The survivors strung the plates up on wires, like laundry drying in the dark. The glowing red embers of the chemical reaction provided a faint, eerie light, perhaps the only light left as the emergency batteries faded. The air around the plates would have been warm and rich with oxygen, drawing the men toward them like moths to a flame. But the rest of the room was becoming stale. The balance was impossible to maintain. Too few plates and they would suffocate. Too many, and the oxygen levels would rise to the point where a single spark could incinerate them all. And then there was the water. The Kursk was leaking. The shock wave from the explosions had compromised the stern. The propeller shaft seals, the rudder posts, The valves. Somewhere, the integrity had failed. Icy, oily black water was rising in the bilge. It crept up through the deck gratings. It soaked their boots. It mixed with the hydraulic fluid and the debris, creating a toxic sludge that rose inch by inch. The rising water presented a terrifying spatial problem. As the water level rose, it compressed the remaining air in the compartment. The pressure inside the room began to climb. Their ears would have popped. The air would have become thicker, harder to breathe, and the water brought the oil. The smell of diesel and lubricants was overpowering, coating the back of their throats, making them gag. But the most agonizing aspect of Chapter 9 is the psychological landscape. They were waiting. The human mind is wired for hope. It is an evolutionary trait that keeps us fighting when logic dictates we should give up. The men of the Kursk were the elite of the Northern Fleet. They believed in the system. They believed that the Pyotr Veliki was right above them. They believed that the best divers in Russia were currently descending the guideline, preparing to latch the rescue bell onto the hatch. They listened. In the deep ocean, sound is the only sense that matters. They would have imposed strict silence. Quiet on deck. 23 men holding their breath, straining their ears against the silence. They listened for the mechanical whir of a thruster. They listened for the metallic clank of a mating collar hitting the escape trunk. They listened for the rhythmic tapping of a diver's knife on the hull. Every settling noise of the wreck, every groan of the steel, every shift of the submarine in the mud would have stopped their hearts. Is that them? Is that the rescue? And then, nothing. Just the drip of the water, the wheezing breath of a shipmate, the pounding of their own blood in their ears. The cruelest torture was the knocking. They took turns banging the SOS signal. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots. They put their energy into the swing, sending the vibration out into the water. They knew the physics. They knew the fleet could hear them. Why aren't they answering? They didn't know that the fleet was paralyzed by indecision. They didn't know that the Russian mini-submarines were ill-equipped and failing to dock. They didn't know that the Norwegian divers, who could have opened the hatch in minutes, were sitting on their ships, banned from entering the water by generals protecting state secrets. They were screaming into a void that was listening but refusing to speak back. As the hours turned into a day, and the day bled into the second day, the hope began to curdle into despair. The flashlight batteries died. The darkness became absolute, a heavy, suffocating blackness that dissolved the boundaries of the room. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. You could only feel the cold water rising around your ankles. You could only smell the chemical burn of the oxygen plates and the stench of the oil. In this sensory deprivation tank, time lost its meaning. Was it night? Was it day? Had it been 10 hours or 10 years? Dmitri Kolesnikov continued to write. He wrote in the dark. His handwriting deteriorated, the letters overlapping, the lines slanting off the page. He wasn't writing for himself anymore. He was writing for the forensic team he knew would eventually find his body. He was curating the scene of his own death. None of us can get to the surface. That sentence, scribbled in the dark, is the pivot point of the entire tragedy. It is the moment of acceptance. It is the moment when the professional submariner looks at the math, the pressure, the cold, the air, the silence, and realizes the solution is zero. The men began to write their own notes. They tucked them into their breast pockets, wrapped in plastic to protect them from the water. Messages of love, messages of regret, messages that said simply, I was here, I waited. The atmosphere in Compartment 9 shifted from a rescue waiting room to a confessional, the bravado stripped away, the rank stripped away. They were just men, shivering in the dark, holding on to each other as the water rose. They were 108 meters from the sun, but they might as well have been buried in the center of the earth. The weight of the ocean was heavy, but the weight of the silence was heavier. The weight was not ending. It was just becoming eternal. Chapter 10. The Politics of Death. While the 23 men in the 9th compartment were fighting a losing battle against physics, counting their breaths, rationing their chemical oxygen, and tapping out messages on the hull of their dying ship. A different kind of battle was being waged on the surface. It was not a battle of survival, but a battle of optics. It was not fought with hammers and wrenches, but with press releases, denials, and the cold, cynical calculus of reputation management. The tragedy of the Kursk is effectively two separate stories happening simultaneously. Down in the dark, it was a story of brotherhood, discipline, and the primal struggle for life. Up in the light, in the gilded halls of the Kremlin and the grey offices of the Northern Fleet headquarters, it was a story of cowardice, incompetence, and a terrifying indifference to human suffering. To understand why the rescue failed, one must understand the paralyzing grip of the Cold War hangover that still intoxicated the Russian military establishment in the year 2000. The Soviet Union was dead, but its ghosts were still running the Navy. To an admiral raised in the paranoid shadow of the Iron Curtain, the idea of asking for help from the West, from NATO, the historic enemy, was anathema. It was viewed not as a humanitarian necessity, but as a strategic defeat. The Kursk was a treasure trove of state secrets. Its sonar coating, its propulsion system, and its granite missiles were classified at the highest levels. To allow a British or American vehicle to touch the hull was, in their eyes, tantamount to treason. And so, as the timeline of survival ticked away, minute by minute, the timeline of politics dragged its feet. The first sin was the delay. As established, the fleet knew on Saturday afternoon that the submarine was missing. They knew on Saturday night that it was likely on the bottom. But it wasn't until Monday morning, nearly 48 hours after the explosion, that the Russian Navy made its first public statement, and when they did speak, they lied. The official spokesman for the Navy stood before the cameras, his face a mask of bureaucratic stoicism, and told the world that the Kursk had experienced minor technical difficulties. He claimed that the submarine had descended to the ocean floor in a controlled manner, but the most egregious lie, the one that would haunt the families of the victims for decades, was the claim that communication has been established with the crew. This single sentence changed the nature of the event. It told the wives and mothers in Vidyevo that their sons were alive. It told them that there was a radio link. It implied that the situation was managed, that the admiral was talking to the captain, that a plan was in motion. It was a fabrication. There was no radio contact. The radio antennas were smashed or submerged. There was no underwater telephone link. There was only the knocking, the desperate rhythmic banging of a hammer, which the Navy refused to acknowledge as communication, because to do so would be to admit the horror of the situation. By claiming they were talking to the crew, the Navy bought themselves time. They pacified the media, but they also wrote a check they couldn't cash. While the Russian spokespeople were weaving this tapestry of deception, the international community was already moving. The explosion had been detected globally. The British Royal Navy and the Norwegian Navy, both of whom monitored the Barents Sea closely, knew that a disaster had occurred. They also knew that the Russian rescue capabilities were rusted and obsolete. The British possessed the LR-5, a state-of-the-art deep submergence rescue vehicle. It was a marvel of engineering, capable of mating with a submarine hatch at extreme angles, designed specifically for this exact nightmare scenario. The Norwegians had elite deep-sea saturation divers, men who worked on the oil rigs of the North Sea, capable of working at 108 meters as easily as walking down the street. Both nations offered help immediately. "We have the equipment," they said. "We can be there in 24 hours. The Russian response was a stiff, polite refusal. "We have the situation under control," they said. "We have our own technical means." This was the second sin, the refusal. The technical means the Russians were relying on were the prize-class mini-submarines. On paper, these were capable rescue vehicles. In reality, they were tired, poorly maintained relics. Of the 4 rescue submersibles available to the Northern Fleet, one was being repaired and another was being used for parts to keep the first 2 running. When the rescue ship Rudnitsky finally arrived over the wreck site, late, unprepared, and disorganized,
The attempts to launch the Priz became a tragic comedy of errors. The first dive failed because the submersible collided with the Kursk's stabilizer fin and had to surface. The second dive failed because the batteries ran out too quickly. They hadn't been properly charged or replaced in years. The third dive failed because the seal on the prize wouldn't hold suction against the Kursk's escape hatch. The Russian admirals blamed the weather. They told the press that there were strong underwater currents and low visibility that made docking impossible. They claimed the Kursk was damaged in a way that prevented the hatch from opening. But the Norwegians, who were monitoring the weather, knew this was false. The sea was calm. The currents were negligible. The failure wasn't the ocean. The failure was the equipment and the men operating it. The Russian rescue technology was simply not up to the task. They were trying to open a complex lock with a broken key, while standing next to a locksmith who was offering to open the door for free. Meanwhile, the political vacuum at the top was deafening. Where was the president? Vladimir Putin had been in office for less than a year. He was a new leader, building an image of strength and revitalization. When the Kursk sank, he was on vacation at a government dacha in Sochi, on the Black Sea. As the crisis unfolded, as the headlines around the world turned from curiosity to horror, the president remained in Sochi. He was filmed attending a barbecue. He was seen looking relaxed, wearing casual clothes. For days, he did not return to Moscow. He did not fly to the Northern Fleet headquarters. His advisors seemingly told him that this was a military accident, a localized tragedy that didn't require the presence of the head of state. They underestimated the emotional resonance of the submarine. The image of the president enjoying the summer sun, while 118 of his sailors were suffocating in the dark, became the defining visual contrast of the disaster. It was fire and ice played out on the stage of global media, the heat of Sochi versus the freezing cold of the Barents Sea, the silence of the Kremlin versus the screaming of the families, and the families were screaming. In Vidyayevo, the cultural wall of silence was breaking down. The wives and mothers, usually conditioned to be the silent, stoic supporters of the military, began to riot. They stormed the officers' club where briefings were being held. They demanded the truth. There is a famous piece of footage from these briefings that captures the raw, unfiltered agony of the moment. A woman, Nadezhda Tilik, the mother of Lieutenant Tilik, stood up in a crowded hall. She was wearing a thick coat, her face red with rage and tears. She pointed at the Deputy Prime Minister, Ilya Klebanov, who was standing on the stage looking small and defeated. "You are sitting there with your fat faces," she screamed. "You have buried them alive. You knew, and you did nothing." It was a moment of primal truth-telling. She was saying what everyone was thinking. She was stripping away the medals and the rank and exposing the incompetence underneath. And then the system responded in the only way it knew how. In the footage, a nurse approaches Nadezhda from behind. She doesn't offer comfort. She injects a sedative directly into the woman's shoulder through her coat. The mother of the dying sailor slumps, her speech slurring, her body going limp as she is practically carried out of the room. It was a metaphor for the entire operation. Sedate the problem, silence the outcry, maintain control. By Wednesday, the knocking in the 9th compartment had likely stopped. The oxygen was gone. The cold had won. But the political dance continued. The pressure on Moscow was becoming unbearable. The international press was flaying the Russian government alive. The families were threatening to tear the base apart. Finally, facing a public relations catastrophe that threatened to destabilize his presidency, Putin authorized the acceptance of foreign aid. On Wednesday afternoon, 5 days after the explosion, the order was given: let them come. The British LR-5 was flown to Norway, loaded onto a ship, and rushed to the Barents Sea. The Norwegian divers geared up. The convoy of international rescue vessels steamed toward the coordinates at maximum speed. But it was a race against a clock that had already run out. The politics of death is a study in the relativity of time. To a diplomat, 5 days is a reasonable amount of time to negotiate a treaty or assess a situation. To a rescue diver, 5 days is a lifetime. To a man trapped in a steel box breathing carbon dioxide, 5 days is an impossibility. The delay was not accidental. It was structural. The Russian military apparatus valued secrecy over life. They calculated that the risk of exposing their technology to NATO was greater than the risk of losing the crew. They gambled that the prize mini-subs would work. They gambled that the weather would hold. They gambled with chips that weren't theirs to play, and they lost. When the Norwegian divers finally arrived on the scene days later, they did what the Russian Navy had claimed was impossible. They swam down to the 9th compartment. They inspected the hatch. They found no damage that would prevent it from opening. They found no strong currents. They rotated the valve. It moved. It wasn't jammed. It wasn't broken. It was just waiting for a hand that knew how to turn it. But by the time that wheel spun, the politics didn't matter anymore. The secrets didn't matter. The PR spin didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the rush of bubbles that escaped when the seal was finally broken, the last breath of the Kursk, released into the ocean long after the lungs that had breathed it were still. Chapter 10 serves as the infuriating bridge between the hope of the survivors and the reality of their fate. It is the chapter that transforms the tragedy into a crime. The men in the 9th compartment didn't just die. They were allowed to die. They were kept in a waiting room for a rescue that was blocked by paperwork and pride. While they were tapping SOS on the hull, the men who could have saved them were sitting in boardrooms, drafting press releases about communication established. The silence of the deep was terrifying, but the noise of the lies on the surface was lethal. Chapter 11 The Flash Fire. The end, when it finally arrived for the men in the 9th compartment, did not come in the form of the slow, freezing sleep of hypothermia that they had likely resigned themselves to. It did not come as a quiet fading of the light as the carbon dioxide levels gently pushed them into unconsciousness. The end was violent, sudden, and bitterly ironic. Throughout the ordeal, their primary enemy had been the water, the freezing, relentless ocean that had crushed their ship and was slowly rising to drown them. But in the final seconds of their lives, the element that killed them was fire. By the time the timeline of the disaster reached its terminal point, likely sometime on the afternoon or evening of that first day, or perhaps early into the second, the conditions inside the safe zone had deteriorated into a chemical nightmare. The air was thick and foul. The 23 survivors, huddled in the pitch black, were suffering from acute oxygen deprivation. Hypoxia is a strange killer. It confuses the mind. It strips away logic and coordination. Men who were highly trained engineers would have been struggling to perform the simplest tasks, their movements sluggish, their thoughts wading through molasses. To stay alive, they were relying on the chemical regeneration cartridges. These plates of potassium superoxide were their only source of breathable air. But as the water level in the compartment rose, bringing with it a slick layer of oil and hydraulic fluid, the margin for error vanished. These cartridges are volatile. They are designed to react with the moisture in human breath, but if they come into contact with liquid water, especially water contaminated with hydrocarbons, the chemical reaction accelerates uncontrollably. It becomes an exothermic runaway. We will never know the exact choreography of the mistake. Perhaps a tired sailor, his hands numb from the cold and his brain starved of oxygen, fumbled while trying to replace a spent cartridge. Perhaps the ship groaned and shifted in the mud, causing a hung plate to fall into the oily sludge below. Or perhaps the water simply rose high enough to lap against the bottom of the hanging sheet. Whatever the trigger, the result was a flash fire. In the confined, high-pressure atmosphere of the 9th compartment, the chemistry of the event was catastrophic. The cartridge didn't just burn, it erupted. A blinding flash of white light illuminated the tomb for the first time in hours, revealing the terrified faces of the men, the black oil on the walls, and the rising water. The fire was intense and brief. It fed voraciously on the remaining oxygen in the room. For the men inside, this was a moment of supreme horror, but also perhaps a mercy. The fire consumed the air in seconds. It created a sudden, massive spike in carbon monoxide. The blast of heat would have been searing, but the suffocation was instantaneous. The physics of the flash fire suggests that most of them lost consciousness almost immediately. They didn't burn to death. They were switched off. The desperate struggle, the shivering, the tapping on the hull, it all ended in a single bright roar of chemical violence. After the flash, the fire died as quickly as it had begun, starved of the very oxygen it had just devoured. The compartment returned to darkness. The heat dissipated back into the freezing steel. The silence returned, but this time it was absolute. There was no breathing. There was no movement. The knocking had stopped forever. The 23 men of the Kursk slumped into the water or onto the deck plates, their weight finally over. Chapter 12. The Note in the Pocket. The recovery of the Kursk was a grim epilogue that played out months after the world had moved on. In October 2000, a massive international salvage operation, a collaboration between Russian engineers and Norwegian deep-sea divers, descended on the wreck. They weren't looking for survivors anymore. They were looking for answers, and they were looking to bring the boys home. The divers, operating from the specialized platform Regalia, cut a hole in the hull of the 8th and 9th compartments. It was a surgical operation performed in the freezing darkness of the Barents Sea. When they finally breached the safe zone, they entered a space that had been frozen in time. The compartment was filled with the water now, the air pocket long gone. The interior was a chaotic tangle of debris, blackened by the soot of the flash fire. Floating in this underwater mausoleum, or resting on the ledges of machinery, were the bodies of the 23 men. The recovery was a somber, delicate process. One by one, the sailors were brought up to the surface, placed in coffins, and flown back to the mainland. But amidst the tragedy of the recovery, there was a moment of discovery that would change the entire narrative of the disaster. In the breast pocket of a uniform, protected by layers of wet clothing, forensic investigators found a piece of paper. It was wet, fragile, and stained, but the ink had held. It was the notebook of Captain Lieutenant Dmitri Kolesnikov. When they carefully unfolded the pages in the sterile light of a laboratory, the voice of the Kursk began to speak. It wasn't the voice of the admirals, with their excuses and their timelines. It was the voice of the man who had lived it. The note contained the roll call. It contained the times, but it was the personal message, scrawled in the deteriorating handwriting of a dying man, that shattered the official lie. It's 13:15. All personnel from sections 6, 7, and 8 have moved to the 9th. There are 23 of us here. We have made this decision as a result of the accident. None of us can get to the surface. And later, in a script that trailed off into the darkness, I am writing this blindly. It seems there are no chances, 10-20%. Let's hope that at least someone will read this. Here's the list of personnel from the other sections, who are now in the 9th and will attempt to get out. Regards to everybody. No need to despair. No need to despair. Those 4 words, written by a man who knew he was about to die in a steel box at the bottom of the ocean, landed with the force of a bomb. The note proved, definitively and undeniably, that they had not died instantly. It proved that the communication established reports were lies. It proved that while the admirals were debating secrets, Kolesnikov was organizing his men. It proved that there was a window of time, hours, perhaps even a day or more, where a rescue might have been possible if the response had been immediate and international. The note became the artifact of the tragedy. It stripped away the political spin and revealed the human core of the event. It showed the world that in the face of bureaucratic cowardice and mechanical failure, the human spirit remained intact. Kolesnikov didn't use his final moments to curse his superiors or scream in panic. He used them to leave a record, to say goodbye to his wife, and to tell the world, we were here. We waited. The wreck of the Kursk was eventually lifted from the seabed in a feat of engineering that was as impressive as it was melancholic. The massive submarine, minus its shattered bow, was brought to a dry dock in Roslyakovo. There, investigators picked through the ruins, finding the melted remains of the torpedoes, the twisted steel of the bulkheads, and the final resting places of the crew. But the physical submarine was just metal. The true weight of the Kursk disaster is not in the 18,000 tons of steel, but in the silence that surrounded it. It is a story that forces us to confront the most primal of human fears, the fear of being buried alive, the fear of the dark, and the terrifying realization that the systems we trust to protect us, governments, navies, technology, can fail us when we need them most. The 23 men in the 9th compartment were not victims of war. They were victims of a transition. They were caught between the old world of Soviet secrecy, where a submarine was worth more than a sailor, and the new world, where a note in a pocket can be broadcast to millions. They spent their final hours in the cold, tapping a hammer against the wall, believing that the silence on the other side was just a pause before the rescue. They didn't know that the silence was the answer. We tell this story not to revel in the horror, but to witness the weight, to acknowledge the hours they spent in the dark so that they are not forgotten in the history books as just a casualty statistic. They were husbands, fathers, and sons who did their duty until the very last breath. Dmitri Kolesnikov's final command to his wife and to the world, "No need to despair," is a challenge. It asks us to look at the darkness and find the dignity within it. Thank you for joining me in the deep today. If you are new here, welcome to the community. We explore the darker, quieter corners of history, the events that are often overlooked but reveal the most about the human condition. If you want to see more ambient deep dives like this, make sure you are subscribed. I have a question for you to answer in the comments below. If you were in Kolesnikov's position, knowing the end was coming, what is the one message you would try to leave behind? I'll be reading through your answers tonight. Until next time, keep the lights on, and remember, the ocean listens, but it doesn't always care. Good night.